As Crystal Bridges in the Momentary, we recognize our role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary cultures of indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of indigenous peoples past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change.
The impetus behind today's event is a partnership between the Art History Department and Crystal Bridges to co-create an MA program in Arts of the Americas. Over the next few years, art history will be nearly doubling its faculty to grow the graduate program with the support of a historic gift from the Walton Family Charitable Support Foundation. These new faculty lines, which come with robust research support, will complement new curatorial positions at the museum in Native American art, in craft, and other areas. So as we strive to reimagine art history for the 21st century in this MA program, we know that Indigenous art and voices must be central. This event is part of an effort to consider how Indigenous studies and art history can influence and reshape one another. Some of the questions we're asking ourselves include, how might Indigenous value systems put pressure on the Eurocentric roots of art history and what the discipline has historically taken to be universal? And how are conversations around these issues different in Canada, in the US, and around the world? If art history actively contributes to decolonization and becomes indigenized, an ongoing process, how might that alter, dismantle, or enhance interpretive approaches guiding art history today? And we might think of specific commitments like social justice or theoretical investments circulating through the field, such as affect theory, the right to opacity from critical race studies, the refusal of aboutness from English and comparative literature. In what ways are issues of access, equity, and sovereignty presented in Indigenous studies and art history, and in the cultural institutions that sustain both? I hasten to add that these questions are not new. Jolene Rickard, professor at Cornell and known to many in this room, I know, put the matter this way in 2017, quote, "The field of Indigenous studies is very different from the field of the history of art," end quote. Pointing to art history's blind spots, she adds, quote, "Critics can readily see gender inequities due to the naming and canonization of the concept of feminism, yet they struggle to factor in an Indigenous perspective," end quote. So what shape might such factoring in take? Heather Atone, senior curator at the First Americans Museum, suggests that, quote, "One cannot imagine an Indigenous aesthetic while using Western cultural standards," end quote. And Nancy Marie Meithlo, UCLA professor and, from what I can tell, total badass, argues that there's still much work to do before we achieve a, quote, "rapprochement between Western fine arts mandates and Indigenous concerns." So why is this? If, as Meithlo writes, the aim of Indigenous art workers is not simply to get in the door of cultural institutions like museums and universities, but rather to, quote, "get in the door and rearrange all the furniture," a formulation I absolutely love, how can those who hold power in these institutions facilitate and actually contribute to this rearrangement? The distinguished speakers today will share their views and raise new questions. Many of them regularly collaborate with one another. So in a way, this is a gathering of friends and colleagues addressing complex issues that animate their everyday conversations, but you're in the room. In the interest of preserving as much time as possible for discussion, the speakers have agreed to brief introductions. Please click on the link that our team will provide in the chat to learn more about their work and accomplishments. You'll also find website links and a list of further reading on the webpage. A reminder about format, we'll have our keynote lecture until 12:30, so it's a central time, a 30-minute time break in the middle, and then return at 1 for the roundtable. So with that, I'm honored to introduce Standing Rock Sioux scholar Philip J. Deloria, who is Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University, a trustee at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, where he chairs the Repatriation Committee. He's also a former president of the American Studies Association, and author of several influential texts, most recently Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract from 2019, a book that studies the remarkable art of his great aunt. Following Phil's talk, Professor Sean Touton, author of texts on most recently Native American literature and disability in Indigenous North America, will offer thoughts and moderate the Q&A. So please feel free to place questions in the Q&A box at any time during the lecture, which is entitled Art, History, Spirit, Aura, the Work of Culture in the Age of Museal Production. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I want to begin by acknowledging my own presence on Odawa territory in northern Michigan, alienated under the Treaty of Washington in 1836. This land has been hosting me the entire course of the pandemic, and I can't say really quite how grateful I am about that. I'm going to go back and forth between sharing screen and hopefully it won't be too messy. It's already messy. And so hopefully, hopefully you're actually seeing a title slide here. I'm just going to assume that you are. I want to just begin by noting that I want to give this talk in the memory of Raymond O'Malley, anthropologist at Indiana University, who passed on Sunday. Ray had a 3-generation relationship with my family. When he was an undergraduate student, he tracked down my great aunt Ella Deloria and wanted to try to learn from her. He was a longtime partner of my dad, and they did a number of editorial projects together. Most importantly, the American Indian Treaties book, 2-volume book, and he has been a friend of mine and a mentor ever since I was a teenager. I find myself at this very moment reading the manuscript that Ray and one of his students have produced that is basically Ella Deloria's heretofore unpublished ethnography. And so it's a kind of a very bittersweet moment, for me, thinking in a full circle kind of way about Ray. I'm going to talk a lot about some Western ideas, but not Western art history per se. So I just want to give you a kind of a short bit of an outline of where I intend to go. So an introduction. The museum is a repository for cultural treasures. The museum is a transforming machine, moving objects and images from one context to another, giving them new life and meaning. The museum is not simply a place of display, but also of performance, as its physical structures call participants to play particular roles: curator, collector, artist, researcher, spectator, critic, novice. With legacy histories that locate its beginnings in the early haze of modernity, globalism, capital formation, and colonialism, the museum is a site of the continuities of the coloniality of power. The museum is an unconscious institution struggling towards self-reflection. The museum is a hyper-aware institution, always turning its gaze back upon itself. The museum is the past, congealed in collections and canons and blockbuster shows. The museum is the future, a space of contingency in which people, things, settings, messages, and experiences create the possibility of the new. The museum is a space of production. It asserts arguments in distinct and evocative ways, and so establishes the conditions for the generation of new ideas. In that sense, the museum carries on the work of culture. It is a shaping force for practices old and new, for individual self-reflection and the crafting of shared social meaning. It reproduces as it transforms and transforms as it reproduces. The museum is both a front stage and a backstage, a show and a rehearsal, a script and an improvisation. The museum is deadly serious, maybe even actually deadly. Be careful around it. The museum is also a site of joy and play, an indispensable gift. Since it is all of these things, the museum is, above all, elusive. And as an elusive thing, it poses demands. Don't think that you know what I am. Contemplate me, just as you contemplate the things that sit inside. And so, part one, Jung and Benjamin. I want to start the contemplation in a debate that unfolded between myself and my father, Vine Deloria Jr. My dad spent much of the 1980s reading the entire collected works of the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, and commencing a project that would culminate in the posthumous publication in 2009 of his book, C.G. Jung and the Sioux Traditions, Dreams, Visions, Nature, and the Primitive. I, on the other hand, spent some significant part of the early 1990s struggling, as I continue to struggle today, to understand the writings of the German critic Walter Benjamin. In a moment of father-son bonding, I gifted my dad with copies of Illuminations and Reflections, Benjamin's most famous essay collections. Alas, the bonding never happened. Instead, we started a round of jousting back and forth, essentially a proxy debate between Jung and Benjamin, in which the former's theories of archaic archetypal images and a universal collective unconscious were opened up to Benjamin's critiques of historicism, understood by him to reflect what Karl Popper would later call inexorable laws of historical destiny. Those critiques, as Benjamin suggested himself, led to the now familiar charge of a relationship between Jung and fascism. I actually like the way that these images line up, where Benjamin gets to sort of glower over at Jung. As Benjamin famously mused in his theses on the philosophy of history, and I should note that this passage I'm about to read, very famous one that many of you will recognize, is not, of course, a direct critique of Jung, but rather a statement about cultural treasure. I should also note in these passages that the historicists are the bad guys. Benjamin is trying to position the historical materialist as a critical force for positive change. Those who currently rule are the heirs of all those who have ever been victorious. Empathy with the victors thus comes to benefit the current rulers every time. This says quite enough to the historical materialist. Whoever until this day emerges victorious marches in the triumphal procession in which today's rulers tread over those who are sprawled underfoot. The spoils are, as was ever the case, carried along in the triumphal procession. They are known as the cultural heritage. In the historical materialist, they have to reckon with a distanced observer. For what he surveys as the cultural heritage is part and parcel of a lineage which he cannot contemplate without horror. It owes its existence not only to the toil of the great geniuses who created it, but also to the nameless drudgeries of its contemporaries. There has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. And just as it is not itself not free from barbarism, neither is it free from the process of transmission in which it falls from one set of hands into another. The historical materialist thus moves as far away from this as measurably possible. He regards it as his task to brush history against the grain. These are powerful words, oft quoted. The spoils, historically speaking at least, are often the domain of the museum. Or perhaps at this point, it might be useful to begin to differentiate museums, plural. Benjamin points in two relevant directions when it comes to those spoils. Thinking entirely in a Western class analytical frame, he observes that the goods themselves are contaminated. The works of genius are supported by the works of barbaric drudgery and oppression. And secondly, barbarism is not simply a class relation. It's also to be found in the process of transmission, in which the spoils are transferred to the victors from those who are sprawled underfoot. It is a critique that takes in the art museum full of the works of genius, and the Anthropological Museum, full of plundered trophies, and the History Museum, burdened with the historicist task of erasing or justifying the triumphal procession. Of these, it is the Art Museum that is perhaps the most evocative. Both Jung and Benjamin, like Freud, were only too happy to build theories on imagined stories of archaic, primitive time, a temporal dreamscape in which supposedly pre-social or early social forms of human experience offered keys to understanding both individual and collective psychology. For all three, the colonial traditions of 19th century ethnology had conveniently established the ground through which one might see the archaic manifested in the contemporary indigenous. My father's most pointed critique then rested on the fact that Jung got out in the world in ways that Benjamin did not, although one could say barely so. Jung's 1925 visit to Taos Pueblo in northern New Mexico thus appears as a major inflection point in Jung's thinking, an actual encounter with the colonized other. Here you can see sort of Jung in his memoir, sort of speaking about how he fell into a long meditation and sort of thinking about someone had actually painted for him a real picture of the white man. This is what comes next. It's classically Jungian, sort of deep mists of mysterious things and images. Interestingly, image upon image detached itself and appeared before his mind. And these are, of course, images that are very much like what Benjamin has just described, right? A procession of conquerors. And of course, at the bottom of this, you'll see Jung sort of making his sort of archetypal kind of, kind of argument here. So Benjamin, in this sense, remained an ethnological thinker. Jung experienced a touch of the ethnographic. My father thought that Jung was the European thinker best positioned for dialogue with indigeneity. For me, Benjamin, and in my view, Benjamin's ethnological sensibilities took shape in concepts that resonated with indigenous ideas. Take, for instance, his writing on mimesis and non-sensuous similarity, which he framed as an archaic ability to see deep correspondences between the cosmos and material things. And that maps evocatively onto indigenous concepts of differentiation within relationality. What intrigued both of us was that Jung and Benjamin seemed to experience the world with an unusual perceptual vision. Benjamin, it has been observed, could look at a doorknob or a piece of stained glass and see, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that quite so soon, could look at a doorknob or a piece of stained glass and see in the object itself the development of a 19th century culture of capital. My father and I both understood such perception of intimate correspondences and relations with the other than human world to be central to indigenous epistemologies. Part 2, museal production. For both Jung and Benjamin, the trick and the challenge created by this unusual perceptual skill that they seem to have lay in what we might name as the dream of what we might call museal production, the conversion of their own unique ways of seeing into communicative forms and practices able to jumpstart similar perceptual experiences in others, how to translate or reproduce essentially metaphysical insights into physical and experiential form. For Jung, the communication of such insights rested on the interpretation of dreams, the therapeutic relationship, and the telling of just so stories drawn from the corpus of global ethnological literature. For Benjamin, it meant the dialectical image, an affective, cognitive, and spiritual experience of deep knowledge that flashed up, as he said, at the moment of danger, when an individual could be transported out of profane time into an instantaneous experience of a sacred, redemptive time that contained all history and all knowledge. The perception of similarity, he said, is in every case bound to an instantaneous flash, It slips past, can possibly be regained, but really cannot be held fast, unlike other perceptions. In our perception, we no longer possess what once made it possible to speak of a similarity which might exist between a constellation of stars and a human being. Benjamin would locate the historical change, the new repositories for this practice of similarity or mimesis in human language. In search of a reliable strategy for creating such experiences, Benjamin theorized about astrology, art, photography, film, translation, literature, and flânerie, hoping that the creation of constellations of objects, words, sounds, and senses might be capable of triggering in others the kind of deep insight that he seemed to experience on a regular basis. Such constellating, it seems to me, can be usefully read as a theoretical brief for at least one critical act, that of display, in the repertoire of acts that makes the museum. So in a metaphysical sense, then, the museum may sit more closely to indigenousness than we might otherwise imagine. Part 3, universalism and particularity or particularism. Well, our little debate had stakes obviously distinct from those dear to intellectual historians of continental thought. What mattered much more to my father and I was what Jung and Benjamin could contribute, not simply to a dialogue that took place in what I would like to characterize as the low stakes and abstract world of theory, but rather to an emergent effort in the 1990s to frame indigenous philosophy as a thing, right? As a thing and a practice, and to assert and insert indigenous epistemologies and ontologies into the wider world of scholarship. At stake was the structural universalizing analysis of the human and the particularistic historical treatment of distinct social and cultural practices. Jung framed his visit to Taos Pueblo and his reading of Black Elk Speaks as moments of universal epistemological clarity. Experience with indigenous people seemed to encapsulate, as he said, everything I have been trying to say about archaic and shared human capacities. My father suggested then that an indigenous critique of Jung was essential. Jung, he argued, had theorized on the basis of weak knowledge, a broadly superficial awareness of late 19th century colonial writing defined by the folkloric capture of indigenous story and practice. And Dakota and Lakota culture, on the other hand, was a deeply pragmatic, practical way of life and knowledge. Could it be more fully appreciated if translated through Jung's theoretical structure? This is the argument of this book, that Jung could make Dakota worlds philosophically legible to non-Dakota people, and Dakota epistemological and ontological knowledge could make Jung better. It was an exercise, in other words, that married together specific content and context with universalism, and not simply Jung's sense of universalism, but my father's own sense of a Dakota universalism that also allowed and encouraged such translation. So a theory and a case, a generalization and a particularism, a pointer, I think, towards museal production, the conversion of metaphysical possibilities to experiential legibility, and an indigenous-centric mode of engagement that was not a priori colonial in nature. So that was my dad. I found myself arguing something kind of similar. At a moment when Michel Foucault seemed so very useful in understanding colonial power and reservation regimes of surveillance and subjectification, I was running around town suggesting that Native American studies should take a closer look at Benjamin. I appreciated the way his Neoplatonism complicated the anthropologist's definitions of animism, and his turn to a theology linking redemption and deep knowledge. His insistence that one could move in and out of different temporalities, or that memory might be an atemporal phenomenon. These resonated in friendly ways with my own understandings of Dakota worldings. Once you got past the 1930s tonality of the language, there were flashes of non-sensuous similarity that suggested the mutual perception from vastly different points of entry of a wider human world, right? In other words, multiple sort of experiences and understandings that seem to perhaps have things to say to one another. If, here's how Benjamin sort of one of the ways he framed it, if from the different languages, one were to arrange words meaning the same thing around what they mean as their center, then it would be necessary to examine how these words, which often have not the slightest similarity to one another, are similar to that meaning in their center. These positions, and to them, I might add Jung's own concept of synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle, took shape in the teasing back and forth that was going on between my dad and myself. As I've suggested, they may also take shape in the form of the museum and perhaps serve as an institutional philosophical resource. I'll just add as a suggestive side note that here too, my father and I found ourselves in productive collision. He was a founding trustee of the National Museum of the American Indian. Well, I've now served as a trustee for nearly a decade, all told. Although I do have to say I've turned over the reins of the repatriation committee to my friend and colleague Sherry Hundorf, who's doing a fabulous job. If one of the things at stake today is the relation between the universal and the particularistic, another and related is the relation, is the connected relation between history and art. And few institutions embody that tension better than NMAI, which is constantly trying to thread the needle between historical narrative and aesthetic representation, always with the legacy whiff of descriptive anthropology, which is constantly challenged by the contemporary imperative to decolonize and indigenize. The museal production of an object or image as art might be understood as a universalizing kind of move. It assumes a human aesthetic response, a common appreciation of form and execution, a deep structural assertion of the possibilities of meaning available to all. At the same time, such a designation is equally particularistic. It matters who created the work, when, under what conditions, in dialogue with who else, in relation to what social conditions. An object's content becomes the occasion for close reading and appreciation of uniqueness. Its historical context offers the grounds for differentiation and comparison. If aesthetics grounds a universal vision, then a particular one relies upon history. Thus, there is a dialectical question about the uneven balance between the art museum's aesthetic engagement with history and the history museum's historical engagement with aesthetics. And so, part 4, history and art. Museum, grounded in the discipline of history, sits in a present that can only be seen as an accumulation of the past, accreted layers of cultural treasure that have passed to the latest ruler, along with the narratives. The past appears as a set of visible continuities, lines of coherence that lead to an explainable present. The future is the home of contingency, accidents, anomalies, disruptions, mutations, exceptions to the line of continuity. And so the present then is like a kind of a wormhole through which a very few contingencies, those things in the future, are sorted and integrated, transforming and reshaping a few of the threads of continuity. The relation between future contingency and past continuity, mediated through a passage through the present, creates what we can think of as the historian's mantra. We trace change over time and explain what happened, sifting the important causes out from the quotidian and the unimportant. And of course, I think this applies not simply to history as I practice it, but also art history as I sometimes try to practice it. Benjamin's critique of historicism rejects exactly this kind of thinking. For him, everything that is well known is for that reason inadequately understood. In the face of true perception, trivial things and great causes would stand equivalent. The museum, grounded in art, adopts a different theory, I think, of knowledge and of being, or a slightly different theory. A Western aesthetic consciousness lives in the past, to be sure. Schools and movements, histories of collecting, cataloging and display, the new always attacking and displacing the old, and so on. When I first attended the College Art Association meetings, I was shocked by this form of conservatism. And it's because I was thinking about art rather than about art history. Art, at least in our contemporary epistemic sensibility, has been elevated as a vehicle for individual and collective self-reflection, and thus potential transformation, and thus the possibility of social change. It is a home in the present for the contingency that historians would defer to the future. And so it demands a kind of rebalancing. If the History Museum refuses to own the future, as historians do, the Art Museum, I think, has little hesitation about such ownership, because the ideologies that we have developed to understand art have pointed to the social mutation field of open possibility with outcomes unanticipated. History cannot be changed, only reinterpreted. Art, through the production of both criticism and artifact, may in fact change what comes next. In that sense, the Art Museum has the potential to be more revelatory, and it thus demands a fuller understanding of the way it establishes its relations between the universal, the aesthetic, and the particular, the historical. For indeed, its claim on the future, it would seem, does in fact rely, at least in part, on a selective engagement with the past. It's not just that the museum as we know it began as a colonial enterprise. It's that the rationale surrounding its aesthetics have also been laced through with coloniality. And by that, I mean to invoke Aníbal Quijano's capacious definition, a modern matrix of structures of power, control, and hegemony that create a Euro-American domination over a global array of lands and peoples. A sort of structure in relation to the specificities of colonialism as it appears in different guises, places, and times. Something perhaps a little like Patrick Wolf's admonition that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. So if the museum is a space of futurity and possibility, then it is also true that its utopian prospects stem from a history of colonial practice, and that the museum is an ontological representation of coloniality itself. As numerous scholars have shown, for instance, the constitution of the human, a supposedly universal subject, is wholly wrapped up in the project of the Enlightenment. And as Benjamin suggests, that enlightenment cannot be disentangled from histories of conquest, enslavement, and colonialism. The human, the museum's sign of universality, is constituted in relation to the less than human, the slave and the savage primarily, but at varying times also the coolie, the rabble, the criminal, the less abled. It is a fatal paradox, especially now. The inclusive universal is made through violent exclusion. The domination that enforces that exclusion simultaneously sweeps up the material goods of the excluded. Humanist universalism welcomes those goods into the museum as its common property, erasing the triumphal procession of rulers and cultural treasures, redefining them as art. That is, until the aesthetic logic collapses under the sheer weight of history, until universalism finds itself compromised by the context of the particular, until the less than human assert their humanity, until the self-reflective critics of the Western traditions unspool their standard assumptions, until the pure products begin to speak, then the museum, as a key site in the reproduction of meaning, becomes what it has always implicitly been, a space of contest and conflict. And we find ourselves defining, debating, and using words such as decolonize, indigenize, anti-colonial, survivance. And so to part 5, aura and spirit. I join a long line of scholars eager to invoke the linguistic trick that Theodor Adorno once played on the museum, in which he ignored the positive possibilities of the institution as a place for the muses and for musing, and instead framed it as a negation, as a mausoleum, a home for dead objects. The trick works marvelously well as a critique of the institutional form as an enterprise of deftly recontextualization. And an indigenous critique of the museum might align itself quite closely around a genocidal intent, not simply to capture objects, but to kill them as well. But what about the stuff itself? I've never once heard from a native person who accepted the premise that museumification removes the life force or the spirit that inheres in objects and images. Just the opposite. Human remains require tending, ceremony, and in most cases, repatriation, to be sure. But those same requirements also attach to material goods, including art, old and new. In a beautifully evocative piece, for example, my student Anthony Trujillo describes Harvard's museums as dormitories, full of sleeping indigenous presence, unpredictable in their wakefulness. Walter Benjamin's musings about object spirit, which he saw as an aura attached to works of art, reveal the contradictions of the museum, specifically in relation to objects and the cultural transformations of history and aesthetics. Indeed, aura has an evocative, if not always analytical, power, in part because Benjamin's own thinking is developmental and contradictory on this term. As far as I can tell, he thought of it in at least 3 ways and probably more. I'm certainly no expert on Benjamin. There's a familiar working definition that we might take from his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Aura, in this sense, is a magical quality imbued in a work of art or an object, something that defies communication or reproduction through the techniques of mass or mechanical reproduction, particularly photography and film. As cultural production shifted from the singular auratic object into the mass reproduced, aura withered. And Benjamin can't quite decide whether this withering is a fulfillment of his own challenge, an opening up of the world's optical unconscious to new perception, perhaps capable of matching his own, that unique perception he seemed to have had, and thus to creating new social possibilities. In other words, could it be an aesthetic experience of something like the dialectical image or non-sensuous similarity, a revelatory perception of a contingency that could redefine the future? On the other hand, the evidence seemed to point in exactly the opposite direction, that the destruction of aura was in fact marked not by something new and productive and powerful, a future, but marked instead by vulgar distraction, the cult of superficial celebrity, and the mass spectacles of fascism. With this definition, fundamentally aesthetic, but also political and future forward, Benjamin then developed other kinds of concepts. Some part of aura, for instance, may stem from the work's presence in time, that is to say, its history and the unique space it occupies. It's not just that the work cannot be reproduced, but that its unique situation helps constitute its aura. And I feel like I must put this kind of text back up on the screen for us to read, because it's in usual Benjaminian sort of terms, hard and complicated and not entirely clear. A strange weave, he says, this is what aura, of space and time, the unique appearance or semblance of distance, no matter how close it may be. While at rest on a summer's noon, to trace a range of mountain on the horizon or a branch that throws its shadow on the observer until the moment or the hour become part of their experience. This is what it means to breathe the aura of those mountains, that branch. Even more evocative is Benjamin's sense of aura as the ground for an intersubjective experience. Aura is a word for what happens when you sense an object looking back at you, returning your gaze. The object with aura has an independence, if not an autonomy. It may rely upon your gaze for its constitution, but having had an object look at you in return, you cannot actually be certain of that. Nor is aura only the product of the intentionality of art. As Miriam Hansen has pointed out, Benjamin's earliest understanding was that aura was democratic and omnipresent. Genuine aura appears in all things, not just in certain kinds of things, as people imagine. The auratic object, the item with spirit within it, necessarily throws familiar Western ontological assumptions into question. Is it possible that the work of the object has a being outside your own ambit? How would you know one way or the other? And if the answer to that question is yes, what does that say about a world that regards objects as inanimate? And what does it say about indigenous ontologies that so often insist on spirit and animacy? The work of art, and yes, I'm expanding, as you can tell, back and forth to the broader world of objects, may well be capable of pushing a person into crisis, not only about the relation of past, present, and future, but about the boundaries of selfhood and otherness. And as I tried to convince my father, saying it this way sounds a lot like a Dakota understanding of relationality, of the volition and selfhood of other than human entities, of how human crafted objects can channel other than human power in ways that act in the world in visible and materialist terms. If the art museum gains its power from the idea that its objects can shape futures, its vision for the location of that change lies less with the art itself and more with the viewer. The art, evocative to be sure, but ontologically inanimate in this Western sort of sense, merely presents itself, albeit in culturally determined formats designed to enhance the evocative quality of the object and thus its auratic power. The subjectivity of the viewer, however, is read as the most active agent. In Benjamin's third meaning, the intersubjective one that engages, I think, with indigenous sort of sensibilities, that relationship is complicated, if not reversed. The object stretches itself towards you. The object is capable of initiating a relationship. The object carries not simply pastness, though it is awfully good at that as well, but it is the active repository for contingency and futures. The object is the location of power. It is unpredictable. It is worth noting that the very moment in which Benjamin was writing about mass culture's destruction of the aura also witnessed the beginning of a near century-long boom in the founding of museums, in museal production, those places where aura might be contemplated, cultivated, and perhaps communicated. And so, a few words of conclusion. Decolonizing a museum is surely about undoing histories and structures of coloniality to whatever extent possible. It's an institutional action. Indigenizing a museum is surely about bringing Native voices, practices, staff, and leadership into the building. It supports Native agency within structures with the explicit hope that Indigenous people will be able to transform those structures. Survivance is surely about rejecting narratives of victimhood, of playing creatively with the structures of domination, of doing something more than staying alive or resisting. It is, as Gerald Visner has framed it, about nurturing an active sense of presence. Survivance has always been a hard concept to grasp, not least because Visner has defined it in multiple ways, modeling its practice through postmodern wordplay. But what if survivance, indigenizing, decolonizing, all sit not only in the actions of human beings and their institutions, but in the auratic being of art and of objects? Things continuous from the past that open up to the contingencies that reside in the future, and things crafted in the here and now of the present that knit past continuity and contingent, unpredictable future together. That's what happens in the present. Wisner's frame, an active sense of presence, suggests that it's not only the building or the staff or the display or the curation or the consultation, it's also the stuff. So is the museum a mausoleum? Not hardly. And it seems to me we need better metaphors. Anthony Trujillo, you recall, offers up dormitory, somewhat reminiscent of night at the museum, in which objects are sleeping and waking, requiring care and feeding in a home away from home. Perhaps the museum is like a cryogenic vault, keeping old dreams alive for future generations. Artist partnerships and repatriation sharing collaborations might embody the cryogenic metaphor, which is not infrequently heard. Particularly, I've heard this in a number of cases around the Pacific Northwest coast, right? Those museums kept our stuff safe, and now we can use them again. We know that the museum is a recontextualizing machine, pulling things into new frames and giving them new meanings, most often the ones that cluster around art. If not a mausoleum box that locks up dead things, we might think of it as a graveyard, slightly different, a place not of cold death, but of active ghosts and ongoing hauntings. The anthropological museum, we know, is often a quite literal cemetery. But in the sense that the art museum's objects gaze back, unsettle things, carry past powers into present experience and future possibilities, they act as haunting presences, ghosts from the past that operate in the here and now in ways unpredictable. Indeed, Jacques Derrida's original usage, hauntology, is deliberately meant to connect haunting with ontology. Hauntology, you can barely hear the H, right? The possibilities for becoming that take shape through the lively return of the repressed object, that bit of cultural treasure that simultaneously evokes unshadowy Platonic reals, the absences that define the museal archive, and the auratic possibilities of spirited, relational things. Maybe the museum is best seen not as a space, but as an act. Call it a ceremony in waiting, the opposite of a mausoleum, a performance that is very much alive. At least some museums, Denver, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Omaha, others, are always already deeply indigenous spaces because the objects they hold are not simply static, but are relational, not dead, but alive, or at least ghosted. They themselves constitute the space, and they speak in one way or another to all those who enter it, and their language is a native one. The work of culture in the age of museal production, then, is cross and multicultural and dialogic, insisting on the philosophical, epistemological, and ontological equality of indigenous thought. My father would say superiority, and he would say that explicitly, and I would agree with him, as a way of getting outside of tokenism. Taking that thought to heart and putting it in relation to Western traditions of museum and aesthetic theory helps us better understand, I think, the complex dynamics surrounding temporality, object relations, futurity, survivance, and reveals that some museums already have an indigenous base, art and objects sitting on the shelves and in the exhibits, just waiting for the ghostbuster, curator, caretaker, viewer, ceremonial leader, appreciator, to invite them to extend their gaze. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to chatting with Sean Touton and perhaps the rest of you as well. Well, while we're waiting for Sean, I was thinking about survivance, today. I counted it up at one point, right? I think there's more than 20 definitions to be found, in Wisner's writing. And I'm sure there's more than that, just sort of 20 something that I found. I thought about it this morning in terms of a fight, particularly because sort of resistance and survival. One of the things that is so important to visitors say, it's not just that, right? And it feels to me like if you're in a fight, oh, there's Sean. If I'm in a fight, Sean, and and somebody throws a punch at you, right? You've got different options. Like one is you can just take the blow. That's kind of like survival, right? You take the blow, or you can put up your fist and you can fight back. That's kind of like resistance. You can duck the blow. That's sort of avoidance. But I think what Wisner's talking about is, and this is interesting because Wisner is so interested, right, in the East, in Asia. It seems to resonate to me with martial arts kinds of traditions, right, where you absorb and take in the energy of the blow, make it your own, and push it right back out, right, and take the energy and the momentum of the person who's trying to hit you, and channel that into something, something else. It's such an important concept to us. I think it's always worth meditating on. And now I'm going to stop because here's Sean has joined us. It's good to see you, my friend.
Hey, wow. Gosh, Bill, this is these are some deep thoughts. and I've learned a lot. I'm so excited to hear about you and some of your debates with your father, Vine Deloria. Of course, all of us in Indigenous studies know his work well, and I'd love to hear you relate about it as his son. By the way, everyone, I'm Sean Touton. I'm a professor of English and the director of Indigenous Studies here at the University of Arkansas, and I'm a Cherokee Nation citizen. So I'd like to begin with a brief moment of my experience. I was we're handling an event at Crystal Bridges a couple of years ago. And you might know this, that a Cherokee playwright had a play produced at the museum, and it was nice enough. We were gathered around a portrait of one of our great leaders, John Ridge. Sometimes people view him as a piece of controversy, because he did sign a treaty that sent our people west in the infamous removal. And yet he was also a very important figure. And in fact, my family were neighbors with his family when he was assassinated in 1839. So Cherokee people were gathered around that portrait, and we had a wonderful explanation of the portrait and its provenance, a word I've learned to use. And there were also a lot of non-Cherokee people looking at the portrait. And we were very much, I think many Cherokees had not even seen the portrait. It's one of I believe, the only remaining portrait of John Ridge. And we stood and looked at that portrait, and a Cherokee friend of mine leaned over. He's an artist. And I said to him, how come they always end up with our stuff? And I said it in a kind of a glib way, and he felt the humor too, but both of us got quiet after that for a moment. And that's often what Native people feel when they see, as you say, that there's stuff in museums. And often it wasn't that long ago that these cultural materials that are very much valued and have stories in themselves, and that is how they live, because they can have the power to tell stories. It was a powerful moment, and it was a moment of subjectivity, because I think other people may have been viewing that portrait quite differently. And it was certainly in that moment, I could feel John Ridge's eyes upon me, and that cultural object, that piece of art, did feel like it was alive. And in that moment too, and this provoked me to think of this after your talk, looking back, I did sense the futurity in that portrait, because John Ridge may have been, I would argue, sadly assassinated, despite his signing of the treaty. He was looking at us and reading us and looking into the future. And it was a moment of futurity in the way you describe in your talk. So I feel good about the portrait remaining alive there in the museum. I do believe it's alive, and I very much in the way that you describe in your talk. I would like to ask how objects can be not just made to live, but free in a different manner in museums. So I just wanted to begin with that statement because it was very powerful for me. I'm not going to talk too long because I think there's going to be a lot of questions and a lot of great provocations. So you begin with the talk about your mention of the museum as a place of contradictions, certainly, and paradoxes, as you describe later in your talk. And you mentioned the notion of the treasures, and the word treasure itself is it can be a disturbing term. It's very much a colonizing term. And yet we tend to think of it in the popular imagination as some kind of bonus, some kind of wonderful find, right? And very much within this idea of the museum is the notion of collecting. And collecting, in the eyes of, Edward Said, is very much an Orientalist thing to do. And museums had begun with collecting. I mean, think the Bureau of Ethnology, put together to collect the materials of the aftermath of carnage when the troops, attacked and decimated Native people, for example. So there's a lot of ugliness and a lot of history, and many of these objects bear a lot of residues of pain and suffering and genocide. And the great question we have, I think, for all of us is how to honor these objects, recognize their life within them, and also allow them to be further liberated. And certainly, all of us need to realize that we view these objects from different social locations, bearing upon our identities, where we're located in the world, where we're empowered or disempowered. All that affects how we experience any museum. You talked about this fascinating conversation between Walter Benjamin and Carl Jung, and man, I just got to say, I wish I could have those debates with my dad. He passed away a couple of years ago, and he is a very religious man. And my dad went to a convention once, and he said, I met this very interesting man. He was a Native American, and his name was Vine Deloria. And so there's a connection there between my dad and your dad, at least for a moment, and fathers figure prominently, I think, in our eyes. So the very notion of time, you called into question with your discussion of the metaphysical. And it's often said that Native Americans conceive of time in a circular manner. It's not linear, it's circular. And in fact, I've had students over the years read Hologun Allen's essay, the Sioux scholar, who said that in The Sacred Hoop that time is circular for Indigenous people. And it may often be a generalization, but nonetheless, it's been a head scratcher for my students. They have a difficult time with that idea. I think because all of us unavoidably in the Western world are very much immersed in a linear notion of the unfolding of history. And it is in a manner self-serving, right? It's how we gain our teleology and we justify our actions, right? With our theories of human evolution, right? For example, the unfolding of humanity, with Native Americans conveniently being positioned in the past, right, as primitive people. So within that idea of time being circular, though, there's also a model of sustainability that's often used, for example, in disability studies and in theories in the environment. So what I see very exciting about what you're laying out in your talk is that Native Americans, in terms of philosophy and epistemology and metaphysics and ontology, have so much to offer the Western world still today. And the challenge, of course, is the relations of power. Our colonial relations are still very much unequal. And I've often said in my own scholarship, to conduct true comparative work, all of us need to work for a more equitable colonial relations. Otherwise, what we conceive as cultural exchange is nothing more than appropriation. So that is one great challenge. I don't know how you would respond to the notion of power as it plays out in museum studies. Well, if you did talk about it at length, of course, but when it comes to the comparative question, that's what I would wonder, how to conduct that. I also wanted to mention that when you describe Benjamin's atemporality of memory and Jung's synchronicity, two concepts that I've been fascinated with in my lifetime, how does that notion of time itself undermine the very task of the Western historian? And the discipline itself, the discipline is very much invested in notions of linearity and certain notions of time. I'm thinking, for example, of Frederick Jackson Turner and his thesis on the frontier, for example. And then for later on in your talk, you mentioned you draw a very good, careful line about the pastness of the museum, how it's so invested in notions of the past, despite the talk about futurity. And as an Indigenous person myself, and someone who's given my life to books and stories and teaching, it's often been very difficult to assert the presence of Native people. And for example, at least once in my memory, a student came to my podium after class, and she was very excited to say this to me. She said, I want to show you something. And she pulled out a Ziploc bag, and she said, we own some land here in Arkansas, and we found these arrowheads on our land. And she showed me a handful of arrowheads. And she was very proud of these. And I was gratified and happy to see them. And it was a very important moment for us, a teaching moment, if you will. And yet I felt, in a way, invisible, that Native Americans, it seemed in her mind, were still defined by this ancient record, right? And I think for a lot of Native people still today, we've kind of internalized some of those ideas, and we tend to think that that we are about the past. In fact, sometimes Native cultures, people will look to a pre-contact or an early contact moment to think about, in an idealized way, what life was like before we were colonized. All right, so even Native people themselves somehow trade in the pastness or the ancientness of ourselves and our cultures. The last thing I want to say, we were running out of time, and I want to give everyone a chance to talk. I just was moved by your ideas about Adorno's notion of the mausoleum, how museums can kill objects, and then a student of yours saying that these are dormitories, the objects live. And that idea floored me. That gives me great hope. And I understand that museums are reforming, and they're doing their best to see to it that objects are cared for, right, in terms of the basic needs of climate control, but also of caring for them as if they to recognize their animation, their aura, as you describe. And the great question I have is, how do we see to it that these objects are free? And I'll begin with one anecdote. Years ago, I visited NMAI, and I saw a wonderful display. It was all under glass and circle, and it was the gorgeous beaded moccasins. And then all the soles of the moccasins were beaded, which meant obviously that they were not meant to be worn and walked upon. Instead, these were moccasins that were put on people when they died and when they were properly placed in the ground under ceremony. These are moccasins to wear to the spirit world. And I'm not sure, that wasn't written up in the statement, and I'm not sure everyone got that. When I looked at that, I had this very emotional reaction, understandably. And I would not wonder how those objects can be made to live fully and in proper care in these dormitories of our stuff. So thank you for a wonderful talk. I hope I did justice in my commentary, and I would love to handle some questions. So I think we have some right now, and I'll read them off. Okay, Lynn Jacobs says, if you want to find Indigenous-based art sitting in museums that has aura, that has spirited relational connection to viewers in the Western tradition, how about medieval art? The Reformation came and destroyed much of that art because of fears of the power of those artworks exerted on the viewers, and spent enormous efforts to convince people that these works were only wood and stone and nothing more than material. We wouldn't classify all artwork by the values of the Reformation. Sorry, we shouldn't classify all art that way.
I don't have much to add to that. I think Lynn Jacobs has, I think the thing that's interesting about this, right, and this seems to me that people who work in museums and work in care and live with objects all understand some elements of this, and putting this in the context of medieval art feels exactly a perfectly wonderful kind of way of thinking about it, right? That there's multiple ways in which objects do the kind of work that we're talking about.
Okay, excellent. Absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you, Mary Coffey says. I really appreciate the proxy dialogue between Jung and Benjamin, your father and you. As someone who also thinks deeply about and with Benjamin, I'm intrigued by your analogizing of his concept of the constellation with the museum. And this makes me wonder about Benjamin's emphasis on violence, not only as a tool of the victors, but also of the material historian who must break the illusion of the world as it appears in the historicist iteration to seize the flashes of messianic truth. Does this part of Benjamin's political theology play a part in your thinking about the museum, survivance, and/or decoloniality? I suppose this might be a question about justice, at least in how I understand Benjamin's arguments about the unanswered call for justice that oppressed past make upon the future.
Future. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think this is exactly right. And Mary, it's really, I think it really does take us to this question about survivance and sort of how we think about survivance as a, as a practice, and not simply a harmless practice, but in a lot of ways, it feels like it's got this sort of parallel to what you're describing, Mary Coffey, in terms of Benjamin, right? It's not just that the materialist historian sort of like, waits for the flash, right? It's that like, there is that language of confrontation, right, with historicism, of sort of like wrenching, truth and justice out of the things which are unjust. So, at least as I understand it, right, Benjamin's sense of like what the materialist historian does is a super active, kind of role. And this, to me, also, this feels to me like very much like what we're talking about when we talk about these things like indigenizing and decolonizing and survivance, and that there is, I think you're right, Sean, that like we're at this moment. It's really clear that like museums, don't look like museums used to look, and they're not gonna look like they look right now. And so there's all this will for change, and there's all this interesting thinking going on. And I wish I had sort of had a full and rich sense of it, and I wouldn't say that I do, but I do have a sense that like it's a moment, right? And things are happening. And then the question becomes like, what do you do in the moment? Like, how does one actually act? It's a little bit, I think, I always frame Benjamin as a guy with a problem, right? You heard me say this, right? As a guy with a vision who can't get other people to sort of have the sort of same experiential kinds of visions, that he has. And it feels to me like museum is sort of in this place as well, right? That we have a possibility for some futures, but how we actually get there is not obvious. And some part, I think, well, let me just say it like this. Mary, since you're a Benjamin person, I'm sure you can do better than I on this, but the very first of the theses on the philosophy of history basically makes this argument that theology is a sort of hidden and wizened kind of thing, right? And if we brought theology out and made it speak, right, we would see things that we wouldn't see before. We would do history in a different, kind of way. And I feel like I'm making a somewhat parallel argument, about this in terms of museums. And when I say theology, when he says theology, he has a bigger meaning than that. When I say theology, I also have a bigger sort of sense of that, as well. But a sort of sense of the fundamental, both incommensurability and dialogic commensurability that happens when one engages indigenous ways of being and puts them at the center. And many people are saying similar things and saying it better than I. But it feels to me like we all have a sense like this is the way, this is the way forward. I'll just say one more thing, and Sean, it's a little bit in response to you. Custer Die for Your Sins, my dad's first book was, had its 50-year anniversary, right, in 2019. And as those of you who know me will know that I did spend a good chunk of my career sort of like, kind of trying to avoid sort of like being, in public dialogue with my father. But I went back and I did a very, very serious, kind of read of this in relation to how we think about Native studies, today. And, it really crystallized for me sort of like what I've come to think of as a little mantra, the 4 things that Native people say, we're still here, stop erasing us. And I feel like the erasure, the efforts at erasure have actually intensified at this particular moment. We think that in the moment of BIPOC and coalition things, but I feel like it's intensified in certain kinds of ways. So we're still here. Second thing, we're not like the other kids, right? We're not like the other 4 food groups of ethnic studies. Like we are absolutely different and unique, and you need to understand, our difference. Third thing, give us our stuff back. Like we want our stuff back. Right. And fourth thing, we have some stuff to say if you would care to listen. And I think this fits into that category, right? We have things to say that are really important, if one would listen. And I'm seeing that Wanda has a question in the chat, and maybe Sean, I'll just say a quick word about this. And then I know we're probably sort of, out of time at this point. We're more than out of time. Wanda says, museums may sit, I had mentioned museums may sit closer to indigenous than we thought. How does that idea sit with the trauma and the wounding that museums enact? And I think this is absolutely spot on, right, in terms of thinking about the complexities of this. That on the one hand, you know, as I think you know, right, I've sort of made this sort of argument that like the things which have been taken as treasures, and Sean, that word treasure is never meant to have a positive valuation to it, right? Is always as treasure, as booty, as plunder, you know, basically, you know, that these things have this, are carrying forward this sort of procession of conquest, right? And they are instances of injustice. But if we sort of imagine that they have a life of their own, right, then we also have to grant that them sitting there in these institutions means something, right? It has meaning to it, and it is, you know, it is important. So this is a way to think in complex terms about the history, but I think what Wanda is also pointing us to is the fact that museums continue, right? It's not just events, it is structures, right? And the museums continue to because they are so, you know, thick, you know, with coloniality, one just doesn't turn away from that, you know, overnight, no matter how much one would like to, right? And so there's a structure to the institution that continues to do harm, and which continues to set up circumstances where, you know, harm is, you know, harm is made possible, and it's a bit of a, I think the museum is in a bit of a, you know, kind of whack-a-mole thing, right? In a way, right? You can deal with one thing and then something else comes up, and you maybe deal with another thing and something else comes up and something else. There's always something coming up, and this is the sense, Wanda, in which I take your comment, right? That there's no escaping, you know, the trauma and the wounding, you know, of the museum, and it's not simply an artifact of the past. It is also a condition, you know, of the present. And I think I'll stop there, and maybe we take our break and we come back in a bit.
We do have one more question sent in, and it's not very long. Is that okay, Phil?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't see those other ones.
Okay, Hunter Atkinson says, can you speculate on how might a museum, or any design for that matter, open people to those auras of those objects? Can we hope that a constellation of oral objects in dialogue can unveil the invisibility of contemporary Indigenous peoples and life to those unable to see them? Can they actually allow a Benjamin-like access to a broader vision?
Oh, Hunter, this is a great question, but I think it is the question that at least in my view, Benjamin never really solved, which I've never solved. I feel like I've had moments where I've had experiences of the dialectical image, right? Where a certain constellation of things has like lifted me out of the present moment and shifted me into this past in like weird ways, you know, uncomfortable ways, powerful kinds of ways. How that happened, I have no idea. How to reproduce it, I have no idea. Some part of Benjamin's philosophy, you know, also recognizes that there is a limit to how much human intent can actually translate that experience, right? Because if you imagine that some part of that experience is also dictated by the not human, the other than human, the beyond human, you know, kinds of things, then you have to understand that there are certain kinds of things that you just don't know, right? I mean, so for Benjamin, you know, and I know there's Benjamin experts out here, right? But if you imagine sitting in this particular moment, right, of historical time, but if you imagine that there's this moment of redemption at the end of time, at the end of history, and that moment of redemption, all things become knowable and all things become possible, right? This is where theology sort of makes its way in. And then you say, oh, and that redemptive kind of moment, that's imminent in all time. And therefore its own timeline, hard to figure out, might be jumped up to, right, from the historical time in which we're at. So you could enter into this redemptive kind of moment and have access to all that stuff that you might know at the end of time with redemption, right? Well, there's no way to control that, right? I mean, there's no way to sort of like say that like you're deserving at a particular moment to have a particular kind of, you know, kind of experience. That doesn't mean that it's not real. And so I think like Benjamin's sort of solution to this is like you try to assemble certain kinds of things in certain kinds of ways, and then you throw it out to the universe, right? And hope that you know, someone in some moment is going to have some kind of response, you know, to it. Which isn't to say, right, that it's all or nothing. Right? It's not to say that like either you have this kind of, you know, epiphany experience or you have nothing, a mundane experience. It does feel to me like there's ways to think about super evocative, experiences that maybe exist on some kind of a, gradient that gets you some little direction there, or affects some people, more powerfully than other people. And this is, of course, the challenge of the person who's putting together a museum show. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time. We did go over time, and we do need a time for a break because we can't punish our participants. So thank you, everyone, and now we'll take a break.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. And for those of you just joining us, welcome to our mini symposium this afternoon. I am Mindy Bisa. I'm Curator of American Art and Director of Fellowships and Research at Crystal Bridges. To begin this afternoon, I'd like to start with our Indigenous Peoples Acknowledgement. At Crystal Bridges in the Momentary, we recognize our role as settlers and guests in the Northwest Arkansas region. We acknowledge the Caddo, Quapaw, and Osage, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water. We appreciate the enduring influence of the vibrant, diverse, and contemporary culture of Indigenous peoples. We are conscious of the role in colonization that museums have played. As cultural institutions, we have a responsibility to engage in the dismantling of historical and systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. We choose to intentionally hold ourselves accountable to appropriate conversation, representation, connection, and education to facilitate a space of measurable change. I want to once again thank Phil Deloria for a great introduction to our day, and one that certainly sets the stage for the roundtable that will continue. Before I turn it over to Ashley Holland, I just want to mention a couple of housekeeping notes. The Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, you can type in your questions at any point throughout the roundtable, and Ashley will moderate those, get to some of those questions throughout and also at the end. In addition, if you'd like to take advantage of closed captioning, there's a closed captioning button on the bar located on the bottom right of your screen. Just turn it on and turn it off if needed. Please also know you can find more information about all of our speakers and participants, and as well as additional resources on our website. So click there anytime. We'll put the link in the chat. So let me first introduce my colleague, Ashley Holland. Ashley will be moderating the roundtable. Ashley currently serves as the Associate Curator for the Art Bridges Foundation. She's the former Assistant Curator of Native Art at the Eiteljorg Museum of American Indians and Western Art in Indianapolis. In addition to her curatorial work, Ashley is a doctoral candidate in art history at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, with a focus on Indigenous identity, cultural memory, and issues of diaspora and Cherokee contemporary art. Ashley is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and currently lives here in Rogers, Arkansas. Thank you, Ashley. Take it away.
My name is Ashley Holland, and I want to thank Mindy for the introduction and just say good afternoon. As she said, I am the Associate Curator with the Art Bridges Foundation, and I am currently speaking to you today from what is now known as Arkansas. And this is a place that I want to give thanks to the Caddo, the Osage, and the Quapaw, as well as the many Indigenous caretakers of this land and water, which helps to support me and many others. Today, I'm joined by an incredible group of panelists. Each speaker brings a unique viewpoint to this larger conversation concerning the intersections of art history and Indigenous studies. While you can find full biographies for each of the speakers in the chat box, I wanted to take the opportunity to allow each of them just to briefly introduce themselves. And I thought we would start with Sasha.
Thank you so much. Okay, I am Sasha Scott. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded lands of the Onondaga Nation, who are fire keepers of the Haudenosaunee. I'm really honored to be having a conversation with such a distinguished panel, and I'm thanks to the organizers for making this happen. And just very quickly, I am an art historian at Syracuse University. I'm also core faculty in Native American and Indigenous Studies, and I work within and between these fields described as US art history and Native American art history.
Then Amy, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I want to first acknowledge the Awaswas speaking Yuwipi tribe, on whose lands I have the privilege to live and work here in Santa Cruz, California. I am an enrolled citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation and an associate professor of history here at UCSC. And I also want to thank Jennifer Greenhill, Mindy Besaw, and Ashley Holland for the invitation to present with this amazing group of panelists today. And thank you all for attending.
Georgiana.
Hello, everyone. I'm Georgiana Olyanik. I am the Frederick S. Eaton Curator of Canadian Art at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And along with Wanda Nunnabush, we co-lead the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department that we founded 3 years ago. I am speaking to you from Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga of the Credit Territory. It is governed by treaties that really speak to us about the way in which we should take care of these great lands and Great Lakes, which nourish us. So I also very much want to thank Phil Deloria for offering us the image of the curator as a Ghostbuster. I'm choosing to think of it as the all-female cast Ghostbusters, because I think I can totally do that Kristen Wiig bit. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Wanda Nunnabush, Anishinaabe Kwe from Beausoleil First Nation, and I'm the curator of Indigenous art at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, which is Anishinaabe territory, Haudenosaunee territory, Wendat territory, Mississauga territory. The boundaries are big, and this probably isn't the way we would have talked about our lands originally. I also want to say that I want to give a shout out that I stand in solidarity with all the land defenders and the water caretakers across Turtle Island. And I also stand with all the folks who are currently fighting corporations and mining companies and all of that jazz that we're fighting really hard against currently. And I want to say I'm Wolf Clan from Beausoleil First Nation, which is a little island in Georgian Bay and inside the country now called Canada. And I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
I believe I'm up next. Matakiapi. My name is Diani Whitehawk. I am a visual artist and independent curator, speaking to you today from Minnesota, from Twin Cities area, just south of Twin Cities area in Minnesota, which is Dakota homelands and home today to Dakota and Ojibwe tribes, as well as the Twin Cities area, which is an extremely multicultural and intertribal urban center as well. So I'm really grateful to be here today and really grateful to be in conversation with all the folks on this panel. So I want to also say thank you for the invitation and thanks for everybody that joined us today.
Thank you. And then we're also joined by Philip Deloria, who will be responding to a lot of the conversations. And we are so excited to have him for the second part as well.
I don't need to take up any more space, so let's go.
Okay, well, I wanted to start by saying that I've asked the panelists to think of this as a conversation. If this was a traditional roundtable, we would all be sitting around and really sort of organically responding to each other. And that's how I want this to happen as much as it can within a virtual space. And so to start, I just want to give sort of a reality that I always keep in the back of my mind as a curator and a student and sometimes a teacher, and that's that the inherent structures of the Settler Academy are not always welcoming spaces and are oftentimes not welcoming spaces for Native people. and that these institutions are wrapped up in white supremacy. And I use that term very, very specifically. And that the theory that comes out of those spaces bleed over into museum spaces and become practice and become the external expressions of that reality. And so Native people understand that trauma within museums spaces is very real. It's something that is not just physically occurring, but also spiritually occurring. And with that in mind, I want to pose a question just for anybody in the panel. And this, I give credit to Diani of bringing up this question. And it's really about why and how has art history and therefore the museum world historically excluded or othered Native art and Native cultural practice in both spaces?
I'll jump in and go first, Ashley, just because we already had a little bit of time to talk about this. And I wanted to specifically jump into this question because I wanted to make sure for anybody who might be in the audience who isn't a Native person and hasn't already lived through this, but wants to understand and wants to deepen their understanding of why these conversations are important, why these panels are important, for you to hear just a little bit about personal experiences to really contextualize why the work is so necessary. And before I do that, I want to quickly say that I also realized I didn't even mention I'm Sicangu Lakota. I'm a citizen of Rosewood Sioux tribe, so put that out there. Was not thorough enough in my introduction, but this question came from my thinking through like the journey of my experience in public school systems and the journey of my experience through education and through the trajectory of my growth as an artist and as a curator. I went to tribal colleges, so I attended Haskell Indian Nations University, which is a tribal college in Lawrence, Kansas, got my associate's degree there first, and then went to the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and got my bachelor's degree in fine arts from IAIA, and then went on to grad school, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Before that, I came up through a public school system within Madison, Wisconsin, and so my formal education, as well as cultural education, is this, great amalgamation of like mainstream American systems and tribal educational systems. After I graduated from Haskell, and I had spent about 5 years in that community, so from a place that really focuses on teaching US history from an Indigenous perspective, from a Native perspective, where we're diving into the intense complexities and horrific history that is the actual founding of this country that isn't taught in mainstream school systems. I thought, well, I'm gonna get my bachelor's degree in fine arts, and KU is right up the road, and they have a really reputable program, and my husband isn't quite done with his work yet at Haskell, so I'm gonna go to KU. And I enrolled to KU, and there was two things that happened that changed the course of that. First, I went to the first week of classes, and I went and I sat in the grand big lecture hall that was just tons of people for Art History 101. And I sat there in the audience and I was all excited, and she went down the syllabus and she talked about everything that we were going to talk about that semester. And it was all Western art, all European American Western art perspective. And I was sitting there and I'm like, I just got done with art history classes that were all Native art and really focusing on, Indigenous art history. And I'm listening and I'm like, art history 101, all Western art. And so I raised my hand. I'm like, are we going to talk about, anything else in this class? Are we going to talk about pre-Columbian art history? Or are we going to talk about Native art history? Are we going to talk about Asian American art history, African American, like anything, and she said, oh yeah, well, we're going to talk about those things, but that's a different class. And I wanted to flip the bird and walk out. I decided to wait and not use my profanities, but I dropped out and I didn't finish anything beyond the first week because I quickly realized this space is not for me. This space is not going to give me the tools and the things that I need to continue to develop my voice as a Native artist. And it was just, that was all the illustration I needed. That same week, I walked into a gallery space on KU campus, and I was young in my journey of education and young in my journey as an artist and in my journey as, I never knew I was going to do any curatorial work. It was early. And I stumbled upon an exhibition. I didn't even know it was there. I stumbled upon an exhibition and I walked into this space and I was only in there for maybe a minute and I just started crying. And it was all cradle boards. And I didn't know why I was crying and I didn't know why it was so emotional. And it's still, sorry, the memory is still emotional. And I was like, I was surprised and I walked out and I was like, what's going on? Like, why am I freaking out from this? And I'm bringing this up because it illustrates so much of what Phil was talking about, and it illustrates our experiences in those spaces. And for me, it was so pivotal because I didn't have any information, any of the kind of like academic information and study of these things that I have now. It was one of those really early on, just, life experiences that turned a course for me. And I called my mom and I was like, Mom, why am I crying? Like, what's wrong with me? And so we had a really good conversation about, why that might be and why that is. But it was such an illustrative moment to me about that life in our works, in the artwork that our ancestors created, and the trauma that so much of is embedded in so much of how that work was acquired, and then the possibility of trauma for when we experience something that's not necessarily curated or handled in a way that's guided by our communities. And there's more that we could go on and really, dig into that. But those two things are just two kind of living examples of so much of what this conversation revolves around. And I kind of just wanted to paint a picture of a little bit of my experiences and hopefully hear from other folks on, why this work is so important.
Thank you, Deannie. That, I think that a lot of us have had that experience in many ways. And I want to make sure that if anybody else wants to respond to that, please do.
Maybe I'll just say a little bit, when we talked about this earlier, Deannie thought it would be worth me sharing my journey in this to becoming a scholar of Indigenous art. Because at no point in my educational career did I have the opportunity to study Native North American visual or material culture. It wasn't in the departments. My institutions didn't have Indigenous studies. And if you look at institutions today, that's state schools, Ivy Leagues, liberal arts college, that problem still stands. When an institution has somebody who works on visual or material culture, Indigenous, it's often housed in another department. There's very few places, forward-thinking places, that have people dedicated to the study of this. And I think in some ways it's because it's treated as a niche field. Like, we need 3 people to teach 150 years of European art, but we can't hire one person to do 3,000 years on 2 continents. So I have heard arguments like, oh, you couldn't feel your classes, and like, you can. The students are hungry for this. I was hungry for this. So when I started, I was writing a book about a dissertation about Anglo representations of Pueblo peoples. And as I did this work, I realized that obviously Pueblo activists and artists were an important part of this story. And so as I wrote the book, I went to try to tell that story. And early on, I learned that from many, many mistakes, that I was completely unequipped. I had no training to do research and writing about Pueblo art ethically. So I was sort of at sea, and I had found myself at the School for Advanced Research Indian Arts Research Center in 2011 as a fellow. And I mean, honestly, I owe so much to the staff there, Cynthia Chavez-Lamar and Lisa Poon, because they very patiently but very firmly explained the protocols that I needed to follow to do the work that I wanted to do. And they kind of set me down a path of self-study that happened outside of my educational training, in which for the last 10 years, and I'm still learning and listening and reading within Indigenous studies from Indigenous scholars, from Indigenous communities, in order to do more ethical work. And I want to say, not just do more ethical work within Indigenous studies, but also returning to the field of US art history and thinking really critically about the stories that are being told, by whom, for whom, what's being excluded, and how master narratives and white supremacy is being sort of entrenched in the stories we naturalize along the way. So thank you.
I wondered if I could jump in here at this point, just because I was thinking about where we get our education. And I'm educated both in Indigenous studies and art history, so it's I've had both, but that's not actually where I do my learning. It's like at the feet of elders, it's in our community, and I would say also at through the engagement with contemporary Indigenous art. So I just want to talk about this work because it changed my engagement with this piece when I saw it, my experience of it, Marianne Nicholson, The House of Ghosts, and it really fits so well with what everyone was talking about. Really changed my gaze and my curatorial practice, also my artistic practice. And it was the first time I was like, oh, maybe I should look at museums because really I wasn't interested before this moment. This work was actually done in 2008. So Marianne Nicholson's a Kwakwaka'wakw artist, Northwest Coast in the colonial nomenclature. This is a ceremonial house using high-powered theatrical lighting. It's 30 feet wide, site-specific projection. She deploys Kwakwaka'wakw ceremonial knowledge that speaks to the spectacular as an enticement to the spirits to come out. The spirits' interest, to entice their interest in humans. And this communication between the spirit world and the human world takes place best at night. And so the work actually becomes more visible as nighttime comes on. So it's quite beautiful and performative, and it really blew my mind. So her house becomes more visible at sunset. The figures that are there they heal the sick or they revive the dead. So these are some of the things she's working with. And from her own words, she says, come ghosts, you whose night is day and whose day is night in this great house. I beg you, great healer, to take pity on us and restore us to life. And she says, I was referring to a number of things in that idea, but the way we are mirrors of each other, the spirit world and the human. So talking about that interconnectedness, but also as a the great house and the great healer, the way in which museums, how could they be spaces of healing? How could they be spaces for Indigenous healing? But also healing for the Western world, because it's a different kind of trauma on both sides. She talked about, and what really hit me is she talked about this museum, which is the Vancouver Art Gallery in British Columbia, and the way it was formerly a courthouse. So it's actually, when she walks in, she's not only walking into the space of her contemporary art practice and the space of artists, she's also walking into the past, a space that jailed her ancestors for practicing their culture, the very culture she's placing on the front of the building. In 1921, so I should go back a bit because it's really important that, your question about what art history excludes. And I think one of them is the acknowledgement and the interrogation of the criminalization of culture. So you can't really start the story without that story. And in the Canadian context, and I know there's an American context for this too, but the law came in 1880, which banned the potlatch. We called it the potlatch ban, but then eventually it applied to anything that involved any ceremony, any dancing, any singing, and any feasting. So it hit us all right across the whole country. And you can imagine 1880 to 1951, so 75 years, that law was in effect. So what happens is the potlatch goes underground. And then in 1921, Dan Kramer holds one. And it's to celebrate a wedding. 6 days they're going. They're trying to keep it hidden, but they get caught. And then 45 of them get charged under this law, 22 go to jail. But then there's also the hundreds of ceremonial items and belongings that were confiscated, stolen in that moment, and end up being spread across the globe in museum collections and in individual collections. So it's like part of the whole story is contained in this one work. But I was interested in the fact that when she walks into the museum, she's carrying multiple times, multiple spaces and multiple times. So I was thinking about the idea of the chronotope. And so it gave birth to a show called Chronotopic Village, and sort of started making me think about this kind of layered understanding of the museum and our layered understanding of how we fit or don't fit into that space. I just want to give one last quote from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was a massive undertaking in 1995, just to examine the colonial roots of everything and to pave a way forward. And it's a massive undertaking that sits on a shelf and has never been implemented, like every other thing we engage ourselves in. So this provision of the Indian Act was in place for 75 years. And what that did was it prevented the passing down of our oral history. It prevented the passing down of our values. It meant an interruption of the respected forms of government that we used to have. And we did have forms of government, be they oral and not in writing, before any of the Europeans came to this country. We had a system that worked for us. We respected each other. We had ways of dealing with disputes. And it's important to say that it went underground. So it's not like it disappeared. It just had a new form. And then also to say that this understanding of the potlatch, not as singing and dancing, but as a form of governance. And that's really what they were afraid of.
If it's okay, I'll go next. Thank you to Wanda and Sasha and Diani. And I want to return to Diani's points about the power of objects. And when you were describing what it was like to stand in that gallery and surrounded by cradle boards and the tears, that came, I certainly have had those moments. And I was also reminded I opened my book, Decolonizing Museums, with an example from when I worked at the Minnesota Historical Society in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, and the lessons that I learned from the Dakota community, the Dakota family, the Mazudidi and Pazawati families. And I learned some very important lessons about the power and the importance of collaboration that day, but also that objects are living entities and that they embody layers of meaning that are deeply connected to the past, present, and future of Indigenous people. And so I was really struck by that lesson. And that one has really, I think, really deeply informed my thinking, and they are also, I know Patricia Pierce Erickson, who wrote a brilliant book, you guys. I'm not sure enough people are reading it, but it's absolutely amazing, called Voices of a Thousand People. And she talks about now this idea of a palimpsest. And that these objects now, it's like the palimpsest idea. And so I was really struck, Phil, when you were talking about that objects are already indigenizing museums in your discussion, and I hope I'm paraphrasing that correctly. And I really, that led to some thoughts in terms of wanting to really have some conversations about what that means in terms of repatriation, because as we know, they are separated from the lands and the cultures and the communities and the ceremonies, right, that are so absolutely essential right, for them, for their continuance. And so, you know, I was thinking, of course, about repatriation because I'm working on those efforts now with the University of California system. But I really want to, as I said, return to that idea of the multiple layers of meaning these objects embody. And also, you know, the trauma that we know is tied to many of them, that even when objects in museums were voluntarily parted with, right, and all that could be in quotations, there were also overwhelming political, cultural, and social forces that forced the alienation of those objects from our communities. So these objects that are living in these museum spaces, right, have all of these layers and layers of meaning. And I also want to touch really briefly on Sasha's discussion of her journey. I have a PhD in ethnic studies, but I've always identified more as a historian. But given my research interests in museums as well as in historical photography, I've spent some time with art historians. And I have to admit, it's been quite striking to me when I think about other areas and fields of in Indigenous studies that we still have so few Native American PhDs in art history. It seems, and again, I mean, this isn't exact science, but it seems if I did a quick survey off the top of my head, we could maybe count on one, maybe two hands. And I really think there are pipeline issues, as we know, and I think others, you know, have talked to that. I mean, it's really striking to me, and I would love to see a survey of how many of our departments, Deanna, you touched on this, you walked into that KU department, and they didn't even touch on it. But how many of our universities and colleges in the United States and Canada are even teaching Indigenous art courses? Not as part of AOA, but as a separate and distinct course. So then it comes to, you know, when we have our job openings for an endowed professor in Indigenous art and there's no one to apply, I mean, I think this very much indicates that there's a major pipeline problem. And I think that, you know, again, it's really stunning to me. I mean, again, there's more work to be done in history, and I don't want to use history as a discipline that's doing a great job. But I think if we did a survey and looked at the universities that offer courses, standalone courses in Native American history, that number would be much higher than in art history. So I'm just going to throw those out there for now.
If I could, I just wanted to add a small comment because I too went through my art history degree in Canadian art and never encountered anything Native, Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations for my entire 8 years in my graduate studies. But what I wanted to point out as I'm sort of listening to everyone being an immigrant to this country is that I've benefited immensely, and I am forever grateful for the encounter that I have with the 3 Indigenous curators that have worked just at the AGO in the past 18 years that I've worked there. And in addition to that, the contemporary Indigenous artists that I have gotten to know either through their work or themselves. And I think that presence, you know, Amy, you were talking about the pipeline, but even simply that presence, sitting around the table, being able to learn directly, looking at objects together, it has benefited me immensely. And I think that museums have a fundamental responsibility in welcoming curators and artists to truly be active participants on their own terms in these institutions and systems.
So would you like to respond?
I'll just say, Chris, my mouse stopped working. I'm trying to get to my unmute button. This pipeline question is so interesting. And I'm wondering if I could pose a question to, you know, maybe to everyone else. You know, it's curious to me, right, that there's so many Native artists. Like the world of Native art is this incredibly rich world, and it feels so unbalanced, right? How rich the world of practice is relative to the world of this sort of, you know, Native American art scholarship that we've been talking about. And you know, Sean maybe has thoughts on this too, you know, but it does feel to me like on the literary side, there feels to me like there's more institutional possibilities for sort of the professor of practice kind of thing, right? Where you actually practice and then you're able to move into a teaching kind of situation, and then you can nurture people as they kind of move through. And I'm just wondering if that is possible in the world of art. It's a completely open question because I don't really know, but it does seem like pathways for artists to think about, you know, kind of helping to build the pipeline. I just wonder how that works, and so maybe folks have thoughts on that.
I think I'm the resident art historian here. I might have to respond. So yeah, there are professors of practice for artists, but they are there's some departments that are seated art history and art together. There are some departments like mine in which art history, and we're a department in art and music histories, are seated together in the humanities. And then there's always this tension about who should be teaching what classes, right? So I think probably if you were seated in art school, a professor of practice artist would have more freedom to teach art history courses. Whereas in a department in our university, there's a tension between two different schools. Anyway, so that's a whole structural problem that prohibits that very elegant solution to the pipeline problem. I wanted to also say something about the pipeline problem, because the where are all the professors is one question, but I think there's another question too, because I've had the great pleasure of meeting many just absolutely stellar Indigenous scholars, including the ones here over the last 5 years. And what I'm finding is part of the problem is that they do not want to become professors, that there is something hostile to about the academy that makes it not a space that you want to end up. And my question is always like, what does the academy have to do to become a less hostile space so that, and that is everything from how we teach introductory classes. You have a introductory art history, Western art, then you have global art. And your point about Native people becoming more invisible right now, Indigenous studies doesn't fit in either of those models. So it just often gets lost altogether, or Indigenous art. You know, how Western history is taught as a history of discovery instead of conquest, of settlement instead of occupation. All of these things I've heard from students alienate them from how we even teach Western art history. And I'm going to tell one little story here that I've been really reluctant to tell, but I'm going to. But even in US art history, I was recently asked a year ago to participate in a book about essays about creating an alternate history of US art history. And we all submitted our essays, and then I saw the table of contents a couple months ago. And there was, out of 65 contributors, there was 5 scholars of color and not one Indigenous person. There were 15 essays about people of color, but not one of them was by an Indigenous person. So I went to the editor and I said, this is a huge problem. What's going to be done about it? And they were like, nothing. So, you know, I had to withdraw from this, and I don't know what else I should have done. I sent him a list of 100 people that could have been invited, in part because, as you said, it's not tokenism. The people that are not being invited are actively and productively and radically reshaping the field for the better. It is creating a different art history or visual material culture. To not include those voices is an act of suppression. So I've said too much, and I'll stop talking now.
You haven't said too much.
Do you want to name names, Sasha?
I absolutely do. I think the people will figure it out.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for dropping out.
Do you want to name the press? I mean, I don't mean to push you, but
yeah, I was a bit shocked that it was reviewed and nobody caught the problem. It was University of California Press, and yeah.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed, that sort of the popularity of talking about Native art is growing. It's very much, everybody is beginning to talk about it, but the voices of who's talking about it is not changing. And that is problematic. There's always space for allies and non-Native response to Native art, but there has to be a emphasis, or I think Wanda talked about it, a centering of Indigenous voices first, and then followed by other voices. And that's a really important aspect, both in the academy, in the museum world, in the publishing world. It's, you know, in literature, it's across the board. It is not a unique problem to art history. So I wanted to ask Amy a question that she had brought up, and she talked about what methods can be employed within Indigenous studies that might critically reshape art history, which I think is an interesting thing to talk about, because I know within my own studies, I've been shaped so much more by Indigenous studies probably than Western art history theory and practice and methodology.
Thank you for that, Ashley. I did have some slides to show, but I think in the spirit of conversation, I'm just going to kind of try to summarize it. But yes, I mean, when we talked about our planning, it was kind of thinking through some of these big picture questions. And I decided, you know, to think through this idea of what methods employed within Indigenous studies might critically reshape art history, as you mentioned. And by way of background, I think I'm going to really kind of focus on my own research on Ho-Chunk historical photography and the methods that I have pursued as an Indigenous studies scholar. And I hope that these remarks provide some food for thought as we think critically regarding how Indigenous studies may inform art history and visual studies practices and vice versa. I could share some slides. We're all interested in the visual. So here's some of my, the historic photos that I'm working with. So by way of background, I'm currently working on a book focusing on Ho-Chunk history and Native American photography. And my research explores the intersections of photographic images, family history, tourism, and Ho-Chunk survivance through an examination of two important photographic collections, the Charles Van Scoyoc collection, and you're viewing images from the Van Scoyoc collection right now, and the Henry Hamilton Bennett collection. And the Van Scoyoc collection, excuse me, includes nearly 1,000 photos of Ho-Chunk people taken between 1879 and 1942. And the Bennett collection is comprised of thousands of images of tribal members taken from 1865 through 1960. And it also contains film reels of the Stand Rock Indian ceremonial, which is a major tourist attraction in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin, from roughly the 1920s through the 1990s. And actually my parents met. My mother was there at the Stand Rock Indian ceremonial. My father was a dancer and performer, and my mother was a white tourist from Chicago. So it has great personal resonance for me. So both of these collections comprise an amazing visual legacy for Ho-Chunk people, documenting a long neglected period in Native American history, the so-called dark ages of the late 19th and early 20th century. But I don't know if we can say it's as dark, because there's been some amazing work that have been coming out lately. But anyway, that still was previously a very understudied area. And also the materials represent and convey a deep history of Ho-Chunk resilience and survivance, along with the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And as part of the project, I'm conducting oral history interviews with Ho-Chunk community members and elders who are related to those captured in the frame or may themselves be featured in the photographs, to develop a history of the Ho-Chunk Nation during the 19th and 20th century. And so, you know, I've mentioned previously that I'm, using the historical photography as the primary of the primary sources that I'm working with. So I've published at length, or not published at length, excuse me, not at length, but I've discussed it over the last several years on the potential of photographs to inspire an active reclaiming of cultural heritage. So I'm really thinking about how we begin to theorize Indigenous engagements with historical photography as part of heritage reclamation projects. And this gets complicated, as we know, because of the role that photography has played in the service of colonialism as a documentary project to convey a vanishing race, or in creating the anthropological or exoticized other. And that's been well covered in the scholarly literature. And my research really centers on trying to rework the photographic archive to really provide visual testimony to the ongoing presence and persistence of the Ho-Chunk Nation in the aftermath of settler colonial violence and the forced removals from our homeland in Wisconsin. I have pursued decolonizing methodological practices when analyzing the photographs, and that these practices involve privileging Indigenous perspectives and placing Native American voices at the center of the narrative. This approach includes identifying and naming individuals in the frame, which is significant as Native people, as we know, often remain nameless in the historical record. And we are moving away from discussions of a nameless generic Indian in photographic works to the specificity that our relatives so rightfully deserve. And decolonizing practices also seek to have the broadest representation of community members possible in publications in order to exemplify the central aspects of Indigenous tribal nations, which is family and kinship. And this practice employs community-based research protocols, including oral history interviews or oral interviews. And community-based research is essential to this methodology, given that meanings assigned to images from a Native perspective may vary from or even be in opposition to the traditional scholarship on historical photography. Art historical scholarship, as a leading Indigenous scholar has argued, quote, typically adopts an abstract and sometimes obtuse theorization of photographs that do not attend to Indigenous protocols or ethics, end quote. So my own family is well represented in the collections, and I'll never forget my first encounter with these images, the Charles Van Scoik collections, in the summer of 1993, while working as an exhibit researcher at the Minnesota Historical Society. Now, seeing these images of my ancestors led to a series of conversations with my grandparents, Anne and Samuel Lontree, and other Ho-Chunk relatives. And through these conversations, I came to know my own family history and tribal history in profound and deeply moving ways, meaningful ways. And in the decades since, I have read and thought through the significance of Indigenous engagements with photography, and I return again and again to these earlier conversations and what they reveal. And what I have witnessed in practice is the story work of historical photography and the ways these photographs are working to help us understand connection to community, history, Ho-Chunk knowledge and culture, kinships, and our responsibilities to one another. Joanne Archibald, along with her collaborators who published the book Decolonizing Research, in their scholarship on Indigenous story work as methodology, they argue that Indigenous story work serves as a has come to encompass the sheer breadth of ways in which Indigenous storytelling serves as a historical record, as a form of teaching and learning, and as an expression of Indigenous culture and identity. And as we engage with the photographs and the stories that they inspire, we are reminded of the central importance of story as method and how these images are mobilized in the present to rewrite history and reclaim connection to family, place, and tribal nation. And so I experienced that firsthand. So one of the things that I was thinking through in this idea of Indigenous story work can also be applied to objects in museum exhibitions as well. But I really want to think through the ways that we are mobilizing historical photography in the present through this story work. You know, there's work that's happening. These photographs are doing work in the present for Indigenous people. And just really quickly, I know this is a longer response to the question, but just this image in particular, some of the stories that I learned, and I talked about this in one of my articles, I learned some really important and painful truths about my own family history and the history of the Ho-Chunk Nation in the 20th century through conversations regarding this image. And this is an image of one of my relatives, Mabel Mary Lontree. And it was an image that was lost for a while. Researchers, we published a book called People of the Big Voice. We didn't, when we were working on that, we found this image very late in the research process. And one of our researchers actually was in a storeroom at the site where it was originally held and said, you know, he said it almost like there was something calling him to look in a particular area, and that's when he found it. And he called me immediately to tell me this story about this picture. And, you know, I couldn't help but smile when I saw it as I looked at the picture of this chubby cheeked, lovely girl with big dark eyes whose expressions and bearing speak to a lively spirit beyond her years. And Mabel Mary is the daughter of my great-great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandmother. And she's seen here in the center of the frame, dressed in the finest Ho-Chunk regalia. She even has a little pahe, which is a distinctive hair tie that only Ho-Chunk women wear, and she is wearing that. So someone lovingly cared for her and brought her into the studio that day. And the family history and genealogical information that I learned really uncovered a very difficult and painful truth. And I learned shortly after viewing the image that she died in 1906 of influenza, just a few years after the image was taken. And influenza devastated Ho-Chunk communities along with other diseases in successive waves in the early 20th century. And she was the oldest daughter, as I said, of my great-great-grandparents. And she died at the age of 5. And her mother had died of influenza 4 years earlier, and her sister in January of 1905, and her brother Howard 1 month after her. And I learned that my great-grandfather, George Lonetree, was the only child of Alex and Kate Lonetree to survive the epidemics sweeping Ho-Chunk country during this period. So, you know, as I said, you know, it was really stunning and very painful to learn, you know, about the losses that my family experienced, which I heard in the past in snippets, right? But this photograph inspired that level of detail of what had happened to my family. And it helped me understand, you know, my great-great-grandfather, Alex Lonetree, I think much more fully. I mean, he goes on to remarry, has another daughter, and by all accounts lives an active member of the community. And his story of survivance is just one that is shared with many Ho-Chunk people. But that's, you know, excuse me, the story work of that photograph has given so much, I think, richness to my understanding of the early 20th century experience. So I just offer that as one example of the kind of story work that's happening around these historic photographs.
Thank you, Amy. You know, expanding on that, I wonder if, Wanda, if you want to talk about sort of how you're using Indigenous methodologies, Indigenous governance and values in the museum space as well.
I'll do my best to come up with all of what Amy was talking about.
Oh, it's incredible.
Totally related. But maybe I'll walk from what Amy was saying, what is sparking in me, towards what you're asking. And I was thinking about how art history doesn't really understand the research colonialism nexus and the relationship between those two things. And, you know, Amy made the provocation that decolonizing methodologies, you know, this is one of the things that could be useful to art history. And I think we all feel that for sure. But I was also thinking about what, at one point in my own education, I realized I was constantly talking about Anishinaabe thought and talking about these things, but I wasn't really embodying it in my actual practice. Like when I gave a paper or when I was writing or how I did my research. So I started thinking about what is it to stand inside as a fully Anishinaabe person inside the academy, inside my studies. And it made me start writing differently, talking differently. And then I was thinking something that art history has never really been able to make sense of, and why I don't sit in there, and why I don't have a PhD in art history and therefore can't get a job that I think I am qualified for without the PhD, is I think partly this focus on experiential learning, this idea that that you have to actually live and embody what you talk about and what you write about. In Anishinaabe, the word for truth is Debwewin, which, you know, if you anglicize it and break it down, it means heart knowledge. But then you have to break that down further, you know, to think about, okay, so heart knowledge is not like the Western sense of heart, you know, it's like not just emotional content, but it is the sense of something that is lived and embodied in real time, both my relationship to my ancestors in real time and to my present and to the future generations that are coming. So it's not necessarily just what I've experienced since I was born, not that kind of simplistic idea. And I was also thinking about the practice that artists have and the way in which they produce knowledge. And this is an artist, Anishinaabe artist, Barry Ace. This is called the Trinity Suite Bandolier Bags. So these are multimedia pieces. They're not traditional bandolier bags. So these are bandolier bags we have in our collection from the 1800s. So what is it to build, to center this work when you're talking about this and you're talking about, you know, a large museum space? And one of the things that he did was in the practice of building these things, at one point he realized he couldn't understand the bandolier bag unless he understood its use on his own body, unless he actually engaged in the practice that it comes from. And so, you know, he took time off from his job, from his career, and just went on, you know, the path he chose was the powwow route, and to learn from people on the powwow path, and eventually came to this understanding of the bandolier bag. But he carries it in terms of his contemporary understanding of where he sits, where his community is, what are those relationships, and also to the media as an artist that he wants to work with. So all the beadwork is done with upcycled computer parts. So thinking about the waste of progress as well. And then inside, these are videos that are playing. And one is devoted to a friend of his who passed away. So this notion of loving and grieving and honoring that is so central to these so-called objects or these belongings that we have. Then there is this kind of racist video in the middle that he discovered in the archives, which actually has his community members dancing. So in 1925, I believe, the government came to town, you know, the officials came to town and they wanted some Indian performances. And so out comes everybody and they do a little dance, circle dance for everyone. This is at the time when our culture is criminalized. So I think the criminalization of our culture is also concomitant or joined to the commodification and stereotypification of our culture. So they always have to be thought together. But then he takes it, like Amy said, he's like, but these are my family members. That's what I'm interested in. I don't give a crap about the the stereotype or the government people, except, you know, to understand what that is. But he's like, this is my community in 1925. Wow, what a find. You know what I mean? And then the other one is family photographs, you know, of him at his, you know, grandmother and, you know, at the knees of all the women in his family making baskets and all that, which is where his artistic practice began. And he wants never to forget that. And then he's also thinking about the way in which these computer practices, the contemporary computer can be, oops, pressing the wrong buttons. How can we think of that as a spiritual space? How can we think of that as a, you know, a conduit to our ancestors, and stop sort of making these separations between past, present, and future as if they are separate, or between tradition and contemporary? Okay, I'll stop there.
Would anyone like to respond to Amy or Wanda? I want to make sure I leave a little bit of space if anybody has a response.
I do. I'd also like to talk about the question just a little bit. And I'm going to bounce around, so bear with me. First, I just really want to thank Wanda for bringing up laws and how much that how much government has, and when I say government, I mean federal government, state government, colonial government structures have affected our artistic production and the way that they're shown and housed and all of those things now. It's really important to understand that. Within the United States, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act didn't go into law until 1978, 2 years after I was born. So for the first 2 years of my life, I'm not that old. Our ceremonies were still against the law. Take a moment and think about that. Let that sit in and understand fully what that means and how that's affected our artistic production and the way that people see and understand us and the continuity of that. And our artistic production is a illustration of our worldviews and lives and experiences and family ties and kinship ties and all, there's so much embedded in that work. That work is an extension of who we are. And it's tied to our practices, our spiritual practices and spiritual understanding and worldviews. So I'm just really glad that you brought that up, Wanda, and I wanted to reiterate to folks to really take into consideration. And it's related to this question of, what methods within Indigenous studies might critically reshape quote unquote art history. Again, we need to emphasize that art history has been taught from a singular lens. So art history when we say art history, and this also speaks to what Philip was talking about, and I believe why so many of us would rather be artists than in the academic system. Art history is abusive in so many ways, and it hurts to sit in those classrooms. And I've done it as a graduate student. I remember my mom was trying to convince, I brought up my mom twice now, was trying to convince me to go for my PhD. And I thought about the art history classes that I had to take as a grad student and how painful they were, to just sit there and be like, know that my history, my people, our story, our connection to this land, it was just, and everything that we've contributed to the artistic production and the artistic lineage of this land base would be a non-conversation, would not be talked about unless I brought it up. And then I'm always the person bringing it up. And oh, she's talking about Indian stuff again. That's the kind of thing you have to deal with within the academic space. And you feel like you can't speak to the people. You feel like you're not speaking the same language when you're in mainstream academia spaces. Because your education has been different, because your understanding of the history of this land base is different, because your understanding of artistic histories and relationships within the land and on the land are different. And you sit and you can only help but think about those things the whole time you're in the classroom. So as an artist, you have a hell of a lot more freedom to say the things you need to say, to be in my daughter is trying to call me, sorry guys, to be in conversation with folks that are already trying to reshape the way our artistic narratives are told. And it's a lot more welcoming and freeing space. And so it's, I desperately want more Native people, more Native PhDs in art history. I want for that so badly, because the outcome of not having that means that so many of the curators of Native art in mainstream museums are anthropologists, which is an issue because those people have not been studied in art history, which means that our work is consistently being curated from a lens of ethnographic study, as opposed to being told within the entire story of our national artistic narrative. So it's consistently othering us, right? And so, I'm bouncing around to talk about all of these things, but I do think that there's ways to use Indigenous studies to critically reshape art history. So I wanted to give just a couple quick examples. One was I had two faculty at the Institute of American Indian Arts, brilliant men, Stephen Wall and Stephen Fadden, Ojibwe and Mohawk faculty, who taught a semester's worth of art history that was specifically tied to legislation over time, and the way that legislation, federal and state legislation, and these laws, such as the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, removal, assimilation policies, boarding school policy, all these policies, how policies shaped art. So the timeline of the class was, this was the law, who was in power at the time? Was it leaning towards federal power? Was it leaning towards state power? And how did that affect our artistic production? That was a brilliant way to think through the lens of Indigenous studies and Indigenous histories, and then think about how that ties to artistic production and artistic narratives throughout time. I think it needs to be a book. I was just thinking about that this morning, so I'm going to hit them up and ask them when they're ready to start writing that book. And then the last thing that I wanted to share real quickly was that I think that when we start to walk into these spaces and we're doing work within museum spaces, we're doing work within academia, as long as we're really, the work of combining with, you know, methods of mainstream methods, you know, Eurocentric methods, that's all going to come very naturally because we're working in those spaces. You know, we're working within the realm of academia, we're working within the realm of the museum, we're working within the practice of curation. That's already there. We bring our value systems and our viewpoints into those spaces. And when we start advocating for the authority of those viewpoints within those spaces is how we can start to shape the way art history is told. So one example I wanted to share was I was invited to curate a small section within the St. Louis Art Museum, looking at their Danforth collection. So historic collection. And I focused on Lakota beadwork and quillwork. And you're supposed to look at the collection, pick out some selections, and present it to the museum audiences. And I picked out what I wanted to look at, and I kind of proposed some of the ideas, and they got really excited about me speaking about the idea of symbolism within our work. So I have my perspective on symbolism, but I know from my own experiences that you cannot read symbolism as a singular, this thing means this thing, and that's the definition. It varies from tribe to tribe, from band to band, from family to family, from location to location. Those stories, from individual to individual, those things vary. And so I asked for some funds to go home to get some gas money to drive back to Rosebud and visit with friends and family and share what I had the access to, which was the collection. So I brought images. I went into the collection. I took all these images, the firsthand images that you can get when you're actually handling works. Took a bunch of images, went home, sat and visited with people, shared the images that I took, and we just had conversations on the works, right? The museum wanted me to record those conversations and then hand over those recordings. And I said no, because it wasn't theirs to have. And that was hard for them to understand, because in the museum's structure, it's about that collection, it's about that ownership, right? So I said no to that, and I advocated that giving me those funds to go home and do that work to help shape simply what I was going to present to the audience was valuable in and of itself, and that they didn't need to have the access to or the ownership of those conversations that I was going to have with fellow community members. That was me making a decision from my value system, right? And refusing that ownership. The other thing that I refused to do was interpret symbolism for the audience. Instead, what I presented was that we can't possibly do that work. Museums present themselves as authority. So if it's on a label, on the museum wall, we're supposed to look at it and that's the truth. And the idea, the model has been, this is the big source of authority. You read this is where you find the truth. You go out and you're enlightened. And so they want to do that with our works too. But they didn't collect the names. They didn't collect the stories of the works when they were made. So they can't possibly do that in the way that other works that have been collected kind of have the possibility to do. Those conversations weren't there. So what I talked about instead was when you look at a pair of moccasins or a pair of leggings or whatever it may be, the maker could have some of that work, some of that symbolism could have come to her in a dream. Some of that symbolism is communal, has communal meaning within her tribe. Some of that symbolism may be a family story or history within her band. And because we cannot talk to her, the way that those elements come together, we can surmise, okay, she's speaking to this particular thing, she's speaking to this particular thing, she's referencing horse tracks, or she's referencing this, but we don't know the full story of what's being presented through that amalgamation of symbolisms, and we can't, and we have to be okay with that. And so that's what I talked about instead, which was taking away from that model of, or not taking away, but pushing against that model of we're the authority, here's what it means, now you know about Indian art.
Thank you, Deannie. I want to give Georgiana, we're nearing our time. This has gone way too quickly. I wanted to give Georgiana a chance to respond a little bit to what you're talking about in some ways of what is the responsibility of a non-native curator to Native artists. That all of the points that you've brought up and that have been brought up through this conversation, that these are very real issues within museum spaces.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for sharing. I think there's a generosity in that. There cannot be enough thank you expressed for that generosity of even just sharing these stories. I think that the primary question that I have that has guided me for the last 3 years is to think about what does it mean to work in relation? And in many ways, the curator of Canadian art, as it has been at the AGO for the past 50 years, could be seen as an extension of those laws, as an extension of all of that historic, colonial, in Canada, actually still imperial, British Empire connected, Canada never revolted. That the Canadian art curator kind of falls into that space. So I think about what does it mean to work in relation? And the first thing that comes to me, which it comes to me kind of naturally, having come from a place where there was one version of history that was taught in school versus the kind of history I had at home, being brought up in a totalitarian regime, meant that I always question everything that is sort of given to me, sort of these inherited things. This is how we do things. This is how we've always done things. These are things have always been done. So that kind of questioning doesn't happen just at a theoretical or methodological level, although it has to, but it actually happens every day in every single action, and that it can be manifested, hopefully one day, into a kind of radical rethinking of small things, like, for example, when Inuit family comes to the AGO and wants to look at their relatives' works. And as the curator, I do not insist on them wearing vinyl gloves, just a stupid little thing like this, to very big things like having an exhibition being titled in Inuktitut and that title not being translated. So there are ways, big and small, and that I guess what I want to say is that everyone in every position has power and has agency to make change, and that ultimately it is about paying attention to that power that you have and simply being willing to do the work every day in everything you do all the time.
Thank you so much. Any responses? Or Phil, would you like to respond to everything that's been said, and then we can move to our Q&A? I like to keep putting you on the spot, I think.
Thank you so much for putting me on the spot. I mean, I think one of the things that really, these are just so important, this kind of sharing and the insights here. I mean, Deannie, I had never actually sort of got in my head straight about like why anthropologists are curators all the time. I mean, and of course, this is, mean, when you say it, it makes complete and total sense. It does feel to me like, you know, one of the things that my students are completely obsessed with right now, and Jennifer had raised this question earlier, is the right to opacity, right? I mean, the right to sort of not disclose, to not, you know, feel like everything is going to end up as part of a, you know, someone's catalog, to not be collected, you know, as a radical kind of act. That feels really like something that's coming to us from another angle. That is really important. I mean, I had a little riff about method, but it doesn't feel like it's quite right. But I do want to, just because I can never resist doing this, I do have to like really quickly share my screen. Oops. So this is the beginning of my riff on method, which is to say, like, I've got on the one hand this one book on American studies where I try to very systematically lay out what a method is, you know, and actually question what method. I kind of think method is the wrong word in a lot of ways. It doesn't really capture, I don't think, what we're talking about. But then I have this other book, right? My book on about my great aunt Mary Sully, and here's these kinds of images which require some kinds of interpretive work, and some of that work is methods that seem to me to come out of, you know, art historical kinds of things, but other things, these are meant to be read. And Diani, I think your sort of sense about kind of how symbols don't work, or, you know, work but are not legible, right? You know, this is also part and parcel, you know, of this work of my great aunt's, which I always have to show because I love it so much. And I'm not going to say anything more about it except to show you two more. And then to sort of suggest that the interesting thing that came out for me in this book is it was very important for me in this book to end with Dakota epistemological kinds of positions that I thought to absolutely fundamentally define the art. And to talk about the figure of the double woman, to talk about the nature of luta and honoring and quill work and moccasin making and all of these, you know, kinds of things. And yet, and this I think fits in exactly sort of where I was talking about earlier, you know, part of the way that I wanted to get into the sort of shifting of temporality was to sort of invoke these, you know, these two European theorists. This is something that I think 2 or 3 years ago made sense to me. It still makes sense to me a certain way, right? There's certain kind of translational things. But these are decisions that I think, you know, I'm rethinking, right? In part because of the kinds of conversations, you know, the kinds of conversations that we're having. And maybe I'll stop there because I know we do have at least a question or two, I think.
We do. The first question is specific to the university system, and it's posed by Deborah Jarvis, who wonders, do you think it's possible for universities to reinvent themselves to stay relevant to younger generations for rejecting traditional learning institutions? And this can come both from a academic or somebody who has been in academy.
I think it's possible, but I think it'll take a lot of work and a lot of intention. Sorry, I'm speaking all through examples, and I hope you guys can, I hope you all are all right with that. But I nearly dropped out of high school. The first high school I went to had a 0.8 GPA when I left because I had an A in art and was failing everything else. The second high school I went to was it was an alternative high school. We talked to all of our teachers were called by their first names. You walk into a classroom and there's desks, couches, or tables. They don't care where you sit as long as you are engaged in doing your work. They interviewed every person that came in and recognized individual learning styles. They taught history classes that weren't overarching history classes, but they taught African American history class, Native American history class. They took the Native history class kids to the res. They took the African American history class kids to Mississippi. They were what felt like truth-telling history classes, as opposed to the classes that I sat in angry at my first high school. I left that high school with a scholarship for most improved student because I actually enjoyed what was happening in the classrooms. I actually felt welcomed and respected. I felt listened to. I felt like I had the ability to challenge notions in that space and still be valued in that space. Like I beefed it out with teachers, but didn't get detention, you know, because they understood the value of difficult and challenging conversations and that we could learn from one another. I also have sat in tribal college systems where I felt like where the students hung out for hours after class because we didn't want class to end, because it was talking to us in a way that was valuable and that we were excited about and needed. And those are the kinds of things that I feel like if we start acknowledging and start bringing into what has been really sterile, larger university systems, it's possible to stay relevant to younger generations that are more invested in change, equity, building relationships across cultures and across divides that we know are plaguing our existence. But you've got to be able to revisit and restructure the way things are being taught. I have a whole lot more to say about that, but I do think it's possible, but it will take a lot of stepping back and assessing the inherent flaws that are built into the hierarchies that have guided the way institutions operate so far.
Yeah, that's what I always say is I think it's possible to change maybe departments, but to change at this point entire institutions feels very, very improbable. And in the same ways though that museums are trying, there are still historical things that we are fighting against and pushing against constantly.
Can I just jump in really quickly? Yeah, so as a university becomes this like corporate thing, it becomes very daunting. But I have to say that we're looking, like we're so focused on the structures that we seem to think that they predetermine us. But actually what gives me a huge amount of hope are my students. My students, look, I've already claimed them. The students at Syracuse University have demanded change at our university. They protested for 2 full years, occupying administrative buildings. They demanded, for instance, an alliance. It was an alliance of what were marginalized student bodies. And they demanded that we hire new people. They demanded that our curriculum change. And at first it looked like that wasn't going to happen, but I have to say that very recently we found out that a huge thing in terms of Indigenous studies was going to be met very soon. That is what the students demanded. They have demanded more of me in my classroom. I can't just give them assignments that recapitulate ideas that they're not, I mean, they have to learn, but so I've had to figure out how to teach them to contribute, to question public knowledge and then contribute to public knowledge. So for instance, on Wikipedia, Indigenous artists are poorly represented and the information is terrible. It's biased, it's stereotyped, it's racist. And so we talk about in our class how we might contribute to Wikipedia pages in a way that's more ethical and fair. So they have to question history. And these are all things that are driven by my students' desires. My students will freely tell me the gaps in my own pedagogy and my own knowledge, and they require me to learn it. They require me to come to my chair and change those things. So everybody's frozen. I think I'm gone. I don't know. I can't tell if, or maybe
I think
you're just frozen. Anyway, so the students are driving change. It gives me a lot of hope. They're smart and they're loud and they're not taking no for an answer. And when I look at it that way, I just feel really hopeful.
I just want to respond briefly. I was going to, really want to echo this point around the students giving us hope. What I have witnessed actually is, in this moment that we're living in this major cultural reckoning, and as Sasha's saying, they're demanding certain types of content from us, and I'm seeing which I think is really exciting. And that some of our scholars in the broader field of Indigenous studies that maybe 10 years ago were seen as these radicals, quotations, right? These activist scholars whose work wasn't given the respect it deserves. I see in the classroom right now that these are the authors that the students are embracing. These earlier activist visionaries, right, are having their moment now with this generation of students. And I just think that has been really beautiful to witness. And if I could just make a quick point on the side of universities, because I've been thinking about this as we're talking about, you know, this change to the traditional learning institutions. One of the things that I think has to happen on the university side is that universities need to basically do a deep dive into their history in terms of, let's just use Native Americans as an example. I've been really heartened to see an institution in my home state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, that from the top down, not just an interested department, right, but from the top down, they're doing an exhaustive historical kind of review of their relationship with Indigenous people. So if you're going to undo colonial practices, it has to really kind of start from truth telling. And I'm currently working with the University of California on repatriation issues. And I think while we are trying to move forward with a new policy, right, if we really want to undo colonial practices, we have to speak the hard truths of the history and deal with those legacies. So as we move forward, as I said, you know, Minnesota, you know, we can follow their lead, but our colonial institutions need to do that deep dive into the history.
I mean, as the person coming from the most, you know, the institution that's clawing its way into the, I don't know, 17th century, maybe, you know, in fits and starts. I just want to second all of these things, but also note the ways that, like, you know, certain kinds of acts, you know, I think looking at the you know, the piece in High Country News by Bobby Lee and Tristan Atone, that like was this massive wake up call for universities, you know, across the country, and the ones who, you know, embraced it and sort of like did exactly as Amy's talking about. You know, this was the occasion for these deep dives into history. And in some ways, I mean, it just feels like those are the things. I mean, this is what we're pushing at Harvard as well. And Harvard is, you know, is reasonably well known for its, you know, kind of efforts to sort of account for slavery. You know, although of course it was late to the table with that as well. But, you know, these are these are models for us to sort of get our universities, you know, kind of on the stick and thinking then what is the accountability to that history, right? Not letting people say like, well, we didn't do it. It's like, yeah, no, you may not be responsible for it, but you're responsible to it, right? And that means actions and accountability.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, like, thinking about the siloed part and young people. When I came into school, I ended up at the end having the choice of 3 degrees because I studied equally in 3 departments. And there's a reason for that. One was Native Studies, which is now renamed Indigenous Studies, philosophy, and cultural studies. So those were the 3. And I used to run from one to the other, depending on what was bothering me with the other. So it's like none of them made me happy and none of them made me feel whole. But thinking about even Native studies, I mean, it was so amazing to be able to think from within ourselves and think really critically about the history and colonialism and learn the histories. But sometimes I'd feel suffocated and not free to think and breathe outside of that. And so I'd run to philosophy because I love diving deep into things, but then that would be really extremely, you know, homophobic and racist and a whole bunch of and sexist. And then I'd run into cultural studies so I could have a little bit of fun, you know, reading and criticizing and playing around, you know, so it's like this circuit. And I think young kids today, what makes me excited by them, they're the first generation that wasn't raised inside the extreme oppression of culture, and that we were all went through. I mean, it's still there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but residential schools are finished. You know, there's certain things that aren't happening, and their freaking confidence inside their own, you know, cultural learning and where they want to go with it, and their critique of the academy is actually quite inspiring.
Hey, Ashley, can I say something before we run out of time?
Absolutely.
in response to one of the questions that came through. I want to really make sure that to acknowledge this question before the day is over or before our time together is over. Wendy Castanel wrote, and for those of, some folks may have gone through and read it already, but it sounds like Wendy is a teacher focusing on African American art, is a Black woman, and is making efforts to make sure that she's including Native art in her classrooms, in surveys on American art, and all of that. So first, Wendy, I want to say thank you. And I really want to make sure to talk to your question because this is something I'm really passionate about right now. And I've been having conversations with some of my friends and fellow artists in the field. And I think this is the next step. I think it's absolutely crucial that we figure out how to support one another cross-culturally to fight this greater fight. I think that we have learned pretty well. We know pretty well how within our own communities to support and nurture one another. And we're starting to learn how to support one another cross-culturally, but we haven't learned how, and we don't have the language or the tools yet developed, I believe, to learn how to nurture one another cross-culturally. And I think it's imperative that we figure out how to do that. And so for me, it's been about also acknowledging that I don't have those tools yet, and I don't have all that language yet, but I do think it's important to start doing the work and start collaborating with other teachers, with other artists, with other creatives and makers, and figuring out how we do this for one another, so that when we're fighting our own fights, we're also recognizing that the histories that lead us up till today are completely inseparable. You can't tell the history of this land base without recognizing the effects of colonialism on Native American, African American, Asian American, every single community that has been oppressed and wounded by settler colonialism. Those histories cannot be separated. They affect and they're so intertwined, and we can't tell this story, we can't tell the truth without telling the entire truth. And once we start figuring out how to put all of those pieces together in our narratives and how to really come together and support truth telling of our national histories and our artistic histories that are responses to our national histories in a more inclusive manner, I think we'll be moving towards those healthier models and those healthier systems, and we'll learn how to be better relatives to one another. And so I don't have the answers for you, but I do want to say thank you for making the effort. And I think that we need to just learn how to lean on one another, right? So if you have friends, if you have, and that's another thing that we should take from Indigenous studies, we can't be the authoritative voice on everything, right? We have to lean on community to bring us to those places, right? Like my female friend who is a Black photographer can speak about Black photography way better than I ever could. And I want to honor that and allow her the time and space to do that. So how can we start working collaboratively with people? How can we bring in other voices and guest speakers? And, now through Zoom, we've figured out that's a lot easier than we thought it once was. So collaboration, working together, and then where and when we can, making sure that we're putting forth as many stories about our artistic history as possible. And it sounds like you're doing that work. So thank you.
Well, we are unfortunately at time. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the questions that we didn't get to today. And if it is possible for any of the panelists to respond to one that they may see that is directly related to them, please try. But Once again, thank you so much to all of the panelists. This has been really incredible and incredibly humbling for me. I am in a group of people that I admire and just am so honored to be a part of this conversation in any small way. And I want to remind everybody that there are resources that have been added to the website that is connected with the symposium. So please make sure that you check that space out. And then I'm not sure if I'm ending it or if we're turning it back over to Jennifer right now. So I will, Jennifer, are you finishing?
No, Ashley, you can
Okay.
wrap us up.
I hadn't thought how we would end.
You're doing great.
So awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Hopefully this is just the first in a long line of conversations that keep going. And as we expand and as we continue to learn from each other, that the conversations are always going to help us grow as professionals, as people, as humans, and as relatives to each other. So thank you so much, Wado. Have a great day.